My name is Steph Herold. I have a master's degree in public health, and I'm a researcher at Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health, which is a research program at the University of California at San Francisco.
Mhm.
And I work on the Abortion Onscreen team. So we study how abortion is depicted in popular culture, especially TV and film, and what that tells us about larger social and political conversations we have about abortion in the United States.
So, how did you get into this work? I'm very curious how you ended up there.
Yeah, sure. So my first full-time job after college was at an abortion clinic as a counselor. So I talked to people before their abortions, sometimes after, to see how they were feeling and answer questions that they had. And often people would come to me with their questions about abortion and misinformation about abortion, that it was unsafe, when really we know it's one of the safest outpatient procedures there is, or that it might cause them to be infertile when, we know there's no relationship between abortion and fertility. And I'd kind of talked to them about those ideas and where they came from and address, some of their underlying concerns. But what really stood out to me that, a lot of other abortion providers have also talked about is that, even with these kind of big overarching concerns, people still showed up to their appointments. So this idea that when someone wants an abortion, they'll do whatever it takes to get one, even if they think it might harm them in some way in the process. So I became kind of obsessed with this idea that of abortion stigma, where it came from, what we could do about it, all the different ways that it shows up, which led me down many different career rabbit holes, and ultimately to public health and research, try to understand how cultural products like TV and film can contribute to some of these ideas, and myths that patients have that they show up to the clinic with. Try to figure out, what it is that we can do about them once we know that they're there, where they come from.
It's fascinating to me that uh, you say that you were interested in how this plays out in media because I know when I emailed you, I mentioned the reference of Maud in the 70s, and that was like one of the first references people have for a character having an abortion on screen. And for students who are listening, who are like, "Who's Maud?" Maud was a television show in the 70s, and she was played by B. Arthur, who became Dorothy on The Golden Girls. But that rocked the boat in so many people's minds that how dare this married woman make this decision? And I think in her context, it was her age that she was late 40s, early something like that. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. And it's interesting to me how it's played out over the years, how it seems like, and you would obviously know this more than I would, but it seems like there is either a kind of hush hush, like we're not going to say the word happening, or there's overt abortion storylines.
Yeah.
Um, I was thinking of this as I was watching the latest season of Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, where
Mhm.
one of the characters has an abortion, but they never actually say it. It's just a lot of silence.
Yes.
And oh, okay, now we're just going to hint at it.
Right. Like taking care of it, or that's usually the language that they use, right? Got rid
Yeah,
of it, something like that.
just not pregnant anymore suddenly,
Right, right. Magically not pregnant.
magically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know people have a lot of strong opinions on abortion. I'm not necessarily interested in the opinion side of all of it. I am interested in how your read on where we're at with the connection between US politics and discussions about abortion playing out in media. And when I read your paper, you talked about the cultural shift in media and how that hasn't necessarily been reflected in our politics. And I'm wondering if you could explain kind of what you meant by that or how you see that relationship playing out.
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated question, and one that I'm kind of constantly turning over in my mind and trying to untangle, because I think there's this real desire to have it be a very simple process, that we see things on TV or in a movie, and then all of a sudden our minds are fully changed and our attitudes are transformed forever. And that as a result, we will vote differently and policies will be different. Um, and I really wish that we lived in that. I mean, sometimes it wouldn't be great for, depending on what we're watching. I wish it was that easy, but it's not, right?
Mhm.
Like you see something on TV. First of all, like there's so much TV now, it's very different than the world in which people were watching Maude, right?
Right.
Where there are like a
Right.
certain number of channels, everybody's watching those channels. You have to turn on your TV at a certain time to watch something.
Hmm.
Now you can watch TV while you're riding the subway, at home, while you're at work, on your computer, on your phone, on your actual TV. And there are like literally millions of things to watch at all times. So I think there's this, first of all, there's a lot of content. Second, like people watch a lot more TV and film than they engage in politics or than they vote. So I
Yeah.
think there's this sense like, oh, does TV and film actually matter? Like I think it's one piece of of shaping how people think about things, especially issues like abortion that they may not experience in their life all the time. So I think it can help give people context, but they're also getting messages about abortion from all different places. Like when they drive down the highway, if they see a billboard, if they go to church and their pastor talks about it, if they happen to tune into a debate among politicians and they talk about it, they read about it in a newspaper or online. So I think the relationship between what we watch and what we think is just very complicated.
Yeah.
Um, and as far as I can tell, what the research tells us is that what you watch can influence what you know, like your knowledge. So the research that we're starting to do about the impact of abortion depictions on people's knowledge, attitudes, and behavior seems to kind of comport with a lot of the other research on entertainment education. Like, when people watch something about breast cancer or about HPV or HIV, in that like their knowledge about those issues goes up, but their attitudes remain the same. Like attitudes are really hard to change.
Right.
Um, and what I'm kind of interested in more than attitudes now is action. So, like, okay, if
Mm.
people's attitudes don't change, do they take any action as a result of what they watch? And that's what I'm kind of curious about in our future research. Like, maybe it doesn't matter if someone personally doesn't feel so great about abortion, but after watching, a TV characters who support each other through an abortion or help a friend pay for their abortion, would they, perhaps do that for a friend too, or is it totally not related at all? Um, yeah. So just I already lost your question. I'm like now thinking about all the
No,
things.
no, no, no. It's got me thinking too, because it's the question of how much of the representation is going to matter in
Yes.
terms of, because you're right. There's a difference between, okay, so I saw this character have an abortion. I'm still not great with abortion, but maybe I understand their journey a little bit. However, it's not going to change the way I vote, or,
Yes. Right.
or will it change the way someone votes? Like, what's the relationship between the two? I think that's a really interesting question to think
Yes.
about.
Yes. And I think also the content and quality of the depictions that people see on screen really matters, right? Like, I
Right.
think part of why people are still so drawn to Maude is because, like, A, it was really good TV. It was really
Hmm.
funny. The characters were really relatable and really good writing. And Maude was a main character, right? There were like 2 whole episodes about her abortion
Hmm.
decision, I think called Maude's Dilemma. And you can still
Right.
watch it on YouTube. And like it holds up pretty much. It's like a
Hmm.
little bit racist. So there's that piece, but it holds up.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of abortion plotlines today, it's kind of like on Mrs. Maisel, where it's like a secondary character and it's a few lines, maybe, and that's it. And my guess is, many people who watch that probably wouldn't even get what happened, wouldn't think about it twice. It probably wouldn't even stick with them a day after the episode. Like you
Yeah.
and I would notice it because we're trained to notice those things and we're interested. But I think for many people, that wouldn't even like hit their radar as something really interesting about that episode.
Right.
So it's like it's not just having more and more abortion depictions, but having, main characters, having the storyline be more than 1 or 2 lines, having it be represented in a way that's medically accurate, socially,
Yeah.
supportive and stigma free, right? Having it be part of a bigger plot line.
Hmm.
Um, so there are lots of different variables to think about.
And I think the dilemma that goes along with it too, right? Like, those aren't decisions that are made easily or quickly or simply. Like, there's maybe for some people there are, but for some people that it's quite an internal thing that they have to go through to get to that point. And sometimes I think media represents it in a very linear way. Doesn't necessarily show you that everyone's abortion experience is totally different, that there's not um, one person's going to have the perfect abortion outcome reaction. Like it's a very complex situation. And
Right.
I think that
Well,
when you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, no, no, go ahead.
And I think that when you say things like Mrs. Maisel, where it's very pushed under the rug, I don't know that that helps. I don't know that that helps with the conversation.
I also think like there are so many abortions that are very easy decisions for people, right? And
Hmm.
what's a lot of people when they're, when they find out they're pregnant, they know right away, like, I want to
Hmm.
have an abortion or I want to carry to term. I mean, of course, some people don't, but the research finds that most patients are very sure about their decision, once
Hmm.
they make it. And the trouble happens in how you access the abortion, right?
Yeah,
How you get to the
exactly.
clinic, how you raise the money, does your insurance cover it or not? Who are you going to tell? How are you going to take off work? What are you going to say? Who's going to watch your kids?
Yep.
And I think all of that we also rarely see on screen. You know,
Yes.
all of those details about, the care work, about
Yes.
the workplace issues, about the insurance issues, the money, like the very real life pieces that come into play.
Hmm.
We rarely see. So I think the TV in particular does reinscribe a lot of these like myths about abortion as like a really challenging decision, or like the hardest part is making the decision, or when really often the hardest part is like getting the abortion, accessing
Hmm.
it.
Have you seen Tuesday's Child? Tuesday's Child? It was a film where she made the decision very quickly and then she had to wait for, I forget what the reason was, and she ended up having the abortion on Valentine's Day. And the depiction was, I want this. I'm ready to have this done now. And it was the structure of whatever was happening that made her wait, so many weeks. And that in and of itself was riveting to me, just to watch a
Mhm.
person who was like, I'm good. Like, I want to make this decision, but these barriers have been put in place that are keeping me from doing it as soon as I want to. And I
Yeah.
think that's an important story to tell too, because we've got so many hoops that folks have to jump through once they make that choice to do this.
Yes. Yes,
And you're
exactly.
right. Yeah, you're right. What do you say to work? How do you get past all of that? So one of the things I liked about your article, well, I liked the whole article. just
Oh,
listening,
thanks.
just so you know,
Very
I
sweet.
was
Thank you.
riveted the whole time. But one of the things that I liked, and this is a bit of a left turn, is you talked about motherhood and how motherhood is presented on television and
Mhm.
how we don't get that full story of what the complexities of motherhood. There's a lot of tropes that I put in my question to you. Like, there's a lot of things that are acceptable ways to parent on television. And then there's some that we just have decided are, this woman is a terrible mother. And yet who's to judge? So it's a little unnerving to me that in 2023, we're still talking about stereotypes of parenting and motherhood on television. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you all found motherhood presented through media, through television, and what kind of parenting you saw.
Yeah. So I'm like an early scholar in motherhood and television. Like that's not my area of expertise. It's just kind of an obsession of mine as a as a mom and as an academic to kind of fuse those things. Like I keep buying books about depictions of motherhood on TV and in film, and it's just fascinating to me to see there's really like decades of scholarship on this. And I think what's one piece that keeps coming up for me again and again is just how few representations there are of moms who have abortions. Like
Yeah.
there's so many moms on TV shows, right? From like the early days of TV till now. It's not something that's rare, right? There's so many sitcoms about family life, so many dramas. Um, but we know that the majority of people who have abortions are raising kids at the time of their abortion. But we rarely see that represented, right? And when we do, it's a mom choosing her career over parenting, right? As if the reality for most of us is that we have to struggle to do both. So why can't a mom have an abortion because she just doesn't want to be pregnant? Like, why does it have to
Right.
be, because she wants to pursue being a lawyer, or because she's just done having kids?
Hmm.
Why can't that be a good enough reason for a mom? Like, she has to make some kind of sacrifice. She has to be this like perfect mom. But I think my guess is a lot of networks are afraid of making mom characters unlikable, or they just believe in this binary that, you're either a mom or you're someone who has an abortion.
Yeah.
When in reality, like often it's the same person, right? People have
Right.
multiple kinds of reproductive experiences their whole life. So that's one piece that I've been interested in trying to figure out, like when there are mom characters who have abortions, like what's going on there?
And how are they going to be received too? I think that's a really interesting question. So specifically with Little Fires Everywhere, honestly, I watched the series when it came out. So what, like 3
I
years
know it's been
ago?
a while. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I rewatched the episode where she has her abortion before we talked because I wanted to be familiar with it. And I swear it went it, with everything else happening in that show. I can understand why you all would have honed in on it, but there is so much going on. There are
Yes.
so many isms happening in that show.
Yes.
But the point you made about the character Lexie that I really appreciated was you said, here you have a young woman. I think she must have been 18 or so when in the show or somewhere along those lines. And it happened in the 90s. So to put it in context, she's a teenager in the 90s. And you have this extremely unlikable character. Like she's very much a product of her household, I think, if you watch the course of the show. But
Right.
she is set up to be the very privileged, very white, very wealthy child of very privileged, very white, wealthy parents. And then she has this abortion and she uses the name of her friend who's African American or biracial as as her name so that it looks like her friend is having the abortion. And you talk to a group of women, and I appreciated that you broke it down by race because the show is broken down by race, right? There's a lot
Hmm.
of discussions about a lot of different racial groups. In the field of women you talked to, you said that it was intentionally diverse, and I'm curious if you could talk about why you all made that choice to separate groups of women up based on race, and
Yeah.
then how they viewed what Lexie did,
Yeah.
what their reaction to her was.
Yeah. So we recruited three focus groups, like you mentioned. So one of Black women, one of Chinese American women, and one of white women. And we were really intentional about that, as you said, because the show follows the stories of women with those identities, right? Mia's a Black woman, Bibi is Chinese, she's an immigrant, and
Mhm,
Elena is white. And we wanted to be able to talk about race and motherhood since, like you said, those are such intertwined elements of the shows. And research shows that people are more comfortable talking about race with people of their same race. So we wanted to enable those conversations as much as possible. So we also had focus group moderators who are the same race as the people in the focus group to try to, encourage people to be honest and direct as much as you can do that in a research environment, right? And we found that, of the different groups, the white women seemed most sympathetic to Lexie,
mhm,
which is really interesting to us. It's not like everybody was universally critical of her, but for other characters, they were really able to hold kind of this tenderness towards them and some kind of critique of them at the same time. Um, like like Elena, for example, the white mom, Lexie's mom, is really portrayed as this kind of like perfectionist who goes to all kinds of lengths to, you know, try to ruin Mia's life.
mm,
But across the focus groups, people were really sympathetic to her, plight as a working mom of four kids with who had a fourth kid and maybe didn't really want to,
mhm,
um, who really had to struggle to balance or fail to balance, as we all do, work and parenting. With Mia, they were also very sympathetic to her. Maybe she was the most likable character, but they all also had some, critiques of her approach to her surrogacy arrangement, right? She originally signed up as a surrogate for a couple and then lied to them and decided to parent the baby herself and turned it to Pearl, her daughter. And people were, had some words for her about that,
mm,
even if they were sympathetic, that they might do the same thing. So, but with Lexie, I think because she was written, like you said, as such kind of a one-dimensional, unlikable, kind of snotty brat of a character, I think almost across the board, people were critical of her, not for the abortion, but for everything that kind of went along with it, right? Like using Pearl's name,
mhm.
then going to Mia and Pearl's apartment and kind of emotionally unloading. There was a lot of name calling of Lexie, like selfish. I think someone even called her an asshole. I think the white women's group were a little bit more sympathetic towards her because they recognized themselves in that character. I think one or two of them talked about their own abortions and how they felt alone and wish they'd had a friend like Lexie had Pearl. But But it was, very interesting to see what people made of that character, especially because they, seemed so fond of the others.
Yeah. I like that you said that she was written as kind of a one-dimensional character because it did seem like some of the other ones had more complexity to them. So in general, well, actually, let me ask you this first. This was something I thought about before we got on the call, and I wasn't sure if you'd seen. Have you seen any of the reunion shows of the Real Worlds from seasons past, where they put them back in a house and it's like a new updated? Have you heard of
Not
any
in a
of this?
long I've heard of it, but I
Okay,
haven't
so
tuned in a long time.
in the 90s, there was the Real World Los Angeles, and one of the
Right?
characters had an abortion, Tammy.
Yes, 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 yes.
Yep. So I watched their reunion show. This is a total side note, just to kind of gauge your reaction. But I
Yeah,
watched their
yeah.
reunion show, and they talked about her having that abortion in the 90s. I think they
Wow.
taped it in like 2021 or 2022. And they talked about it as a group. And all of a sudden, all the women in the room started saying, I had an abortion too. I just didn't want to say it on camera. And there was 5 women in that room, and every single
Wow.
one of them said, yep, me too. I just didn't want to admit it. And I didn't want it to be out there. And one woman said, I've had 2. So I'm hoping that means that maybe things have changed a little bit, that from 93, when just one person was able to come forward, to 2021 or 22, that they were able to come forward and say, it was me too. I mean, and not to slice it either way. Tammy was pretty pissed when she found out that all the women had one and she was the only one that was, being focused on for it, or that was able to come forward. I'm curious if you think that there is if 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 you think there's some progress happening, or what you would like to see change with depictions of abortion on screens.
I think there definitely is progress happening. Let me see how to phrase this. But I think it's because of a couple of things. Like I think there are more women and people who've had abortions in general who are showrunners, who are writers, who are directors, who are interested in telling these stories than there were in the past. So I think that that's a piece of it. Although whether networks will give them the money and resources to create those stories is another issue.
Yeah.
I don't know. I hope so, but I think there's a lot of fear about, backlash related to abortion stories. And I think that fear is totally unfounded, but I think because abortion is so stigmatized and politicized, a lot of networks are afraid um, to let creative folks tell the stories they want to tell. And that's not mentioning like the writer's strike and all the issues with the
Yeah.
labor issues that are very real. That are keeping people from telling the stories they want to tell. Um, but all that aside, like in the last 5 years or so, we've seen like not just an increase in abortion depictions, but increases in characters of color on screen who are sharing their abortion stories. We've seen, especially in the last year, like more depictions of barriers to abortion access than we've ever seen before. Whether that's like long drives, getting the money to have the abortion, having to cross state lines to get the abortion, clinics being closed, gestational bans, like therapists are starting this is starting to show up in stories
Yeah.
more so than it ever has before. So I'm very curious, if that will continue, how the stories will evolve as the abortion access landscape evolves and worsens, honestly, like it's getting worse. Um, what
Yeah.
I'm curious to see is if what I hope to see is more storylines about, you know, self-managed abortion and safe self-managed abortion, where people can buy their own abortion pills online and do their own abortions themselves at home safely, and how that also involves legal risk, right? That a lot of states are trying to prosecute people who do that and the legal risks that come along with that, even though it's very medically safe. Actually, the Apple TV show, The Morning Show,
Mhm.
just had a storyline about that, where one of their journalist characters tried to report on a story about that. But I would love to see like something more than a B storyline about it. Like I want to see much more in-depth storytelling about it. So my hope is that we get more focus on that.
Yeah. And most of the major studios are run by men.
Right. Right.
That's one of those things that have come out in the writer strike, is just how, and the actor strike, is how there's 5 men that pretty much run all of it. And that limits what stories can be told, obviously.
Right.
I almost made a joke about how many Fast and Furious movies are, but I know that's contentious.
No, it's fine.
I think that one of the things too that I keep hearing from you, and I hope that it's driving home, is that when we're talking about abortion, there's the decision and whether or not to do it. But then once you've made that choice and whatever amount of time it takes, there's so many barriers that are placed in your way to get there. And it would be nice if media focused on that a little bit of, here, and you're right, the morning show did this a little bit. But it would be nice to see media say, okay, someone has made that choice, then what happens? Like
Right.
what's going on that gets them to the point of being able to have the procedure done? That to me would be interesting to see play out more than the should I, shouldn't I weighing
Yes,
of the decision.
exactly. Yes. And I think some shows are starting to take that up, but focusing on some of the, easily dramatized, very dramatic type of things like driving across state lines, which obviously, many, many people have to do now. But there are a lot of little everyday battles that really add up to make abortion access really challenging for people. Like, that we've talked about, like having to find childcare. That person then has to take off work, one who's, providing your childcare, having to, book a plane ticket, having to gas, having to get a hotel room, all of these little, having to figure out how you're going to pay for it. Does your insurance cover it or not? But seem more mundane, but I think are just part of it. So many people's reality, not just accessing abortion care, but healthcare in the US, right? It's such a mess.
Yeah.
And finding ways to bring that to life on screen, I think would be really meaningful, like meaningfully reflective of what's going on.
Well, I hope you're prepared for every time I see abortion on screen in the future to get an email. So like, did you see?
Please. There's no way I can watch it all or know it all. So I'd love, the more people send me stuff, the better.
I've been studying pop culture and gender for like 2 decades now. And I interviewed a woman last week where we were talking about, she was an economist, and we were talking about the trend of Taylor Swift, Beyonce, and Barbie driving the economy over the summer.
Oh my God, yeah.
And she and I both agreed that the Dobbs decision and overturning Roe versus Wade was what spearheaded this economic turn for women to be driving the economy, because people saw their rights being taken away and they need to put that energy somewhere. And entertainment is an easy place to take that energy and say, okay, I'm going to go get empowered by Taylor Swift this weekend, and then I'm going to go out in the world and live my life in a way that, whatever. But I loved that she made that connection, that it does stem back to this decision happening, people losing the right to have an abortion. And the reaction is going to be an uptick in something pop culture to inspire people and drive them and make them want to do something. I appreciated that. Anyway, thank you so much for talking with me.
It's been great.
And I'll let you know when everything is posted and up, and you can keep it and share it and do whatever you want with it.
Sounds great. Thank
you so much.
So fun.